Well, welcome everybody. Really pleased that you're here. I'm Glenda O. Young, and I'm the Executive Director of the Human Systems Dynamics Institute. And some of you don't know what HSD is, but you've just experienced it. As you self-organized to see where do we need more chairs, who has new chairs, who's moving chairs, and you as a human system have organized yourself. So that's my life's work, which seems a little funny. Arranging chairs is my life's work. But what we do in human systems dynamics is to help people see complex patterns in all kinds of human systems, from inside to global issues of poverty and peace. To see the patterns, to understand them in ways that are useful and meaningful, and then to take action to shift them. And so what we're here for today is to use that practice with our end-of-life patterns. And so I welcome all of you for bringing your own images and pictures and experiences into this pattern space. One of the things that we realize is that we each bring different patterns, and yet as we talk together, we create a pattern of the whole. And so we're going to be thinking about the part and the whole and the greater whole today. So welcome into this conversation. We are suspecting that there will be some coming together and tension release that comes in the form of tears. We expect a little bit of that. In fact, I expect some from myself. So there are on the table packets of tissues. Please feel free to help yourself with those. If you feel the need to stand or to walk or to hug, feel free to do anything that helps you be comfortable. Because as we experience together, the job of this community is to make it most useful and comfortable for all of us. So we welcome you into whatever is going to make you most comfortable and present today. I'd like to introduce our three storytellers who will be beginning this morning sharing their stories. And first is Mary Nations, and this is Mary Nations. And Mary's been an HSD associate. She began in what we call Cohort 6 in 2007. And since that time, she's played a leadership role as a praxis partner with many other cohorts as they grew. And her conversation with Royce, Cohort 1 and many more, began this HSD inquiry into patterns at end of life. And that conversation was at a very critical point of transition in Mary's life, which she'll be telling you about. So, Mary, thank you for your curiosity and your courage for beginning this conversation. So, thank you. Second is Sam Grant. Sam is here. So, Sam, I think, has been in human systems dynamics since time immemorial. He just didn't know it. But he became an associate in 2007 in Cohort 7. And since then, we've learned so much from his vision and his perspective, and there are ways that you've taken us into a world that is a great opening for all of us. So thank you for your heart and your words with us today. Thanks so much. And Michael Bischoff. Michael was the spark for this event. And you certified, you were a latecomer, Cohort 23 in 2012. But Michael brought to us a kind of experience of human systems dynamics patterns that comes in all parts of your body and life and thought and heart. Whereas it's easy for us to see with our eyes and our minds. And that depth and that breadth and focus that you've brought to us has been a real gift. And so bringing us together in this conversation is just the most recent gift from you. So thank you for that. In addition, Wendy Morris, and Wendy was Cohort 8, 2008, and from the very beginning, Wendy brought to us a kind of embodied work with her grace and her dance and her presence. And she's going to be sharing that with us today as a host. So she's going to be hosting. I'm going to support her a little bit. All of you will support her a great deal. But thank you, Wendy, for being here. And to Barbara Graham, who oils the cogs at HSD Institute, thank you. And to Royce Holliday, cohort 1 and many, thought partner. Royce weaves together the heart of the Institute. And so she's holding us in that space. Liz is saying, yeah, that's right, she does that, that's her job. And so thank you, Royce, today and all days. One of the things that we've learned from Sam is to respect and make present our ancestors. So we'd like for you to think of up to 3 people who are ancestors for you, and maybe long distance ones who show up in your DNA but not in your conscious life, or people that you have known who are near and dear to you, ancestors of whatever patterns you feel like you are now. If you can think of 1 to 3. I'm going to ring the bell, and then I'm going to ask you just to yell their names out. Don't worry about talking over each other. They'll hear you anyway. And then I'll ring the bell again and we'll be done. I'll give you a moment just to think about who you'd like to invite into the space with us today. Wendy, if they have more than 3, is that okay? Yes. Okay, good.
Harry.
Leslie.
Ruth.
Adeline.
Bernie.
Joe Bob.
J. Otis Powell.
Giovanni.
Elizabeth.
Michael.
Thank you. And one of my ancestors that I want to tell you just a really brief story about as we're starting today was my husband, John. And what I'm hoping is that this will also help you see when we say pattern in HSD, what it is we mean. So toward the end of John's life, he'd been in the hospital for about a month. And the pattern was so clear. It was a small room. There was a chart that had all the differences that made a difference. All the exchanges in the room were very professional and efficient and all of that. And on May the 13th, John said, this is enough of the struggle. Done. And the doctor was a little bit surprised by that, but supportive. And so we prepared, rolled into the elevator to go to the hospice floor. John was holding my hand. And all of those patterns of fight or flight that had been with us for a month turned into flow, just in that moment. And from then on, the pattern was one of open boundaries. The differences were care and comfort that made a difference. And those days in hospice were really lovely opportunities for us to revisit our 32-year marriage and the best parts of it, not the worst ones. Those we could leave downstairs. But it was an opportunity for us to hold in that space. And then he was gone, but he wasn't really gone because there were so many parts of our lives that still hold him. Our home, our friends, our library hold his pattern in that space. So he persists in that time and space with me. And so I am so grateful in this conversation in preparation for today and in being with you today to raise up that pattern of John and to become so much more conscious of him in this space and time. So thank you for that opportunity, Michael. And so I'm now going to invite Wendy to hold us in her lovely and gracious arms.
Here comes me in my lovely and gracious arms.
Yes, that's right. Thanks, dear.
So thank you, Glenda, for for welcoming us with that story, a personal story, and also a little bit about the story of human systems dynamics. I'd like to talk about how it is that we came to be here today, and then I'll walk you through some of the flow of this morning before we bring on our storytellers. If anybody's having trouble hearing, just signal and we'll speak up or bring you closer. Like some of you in this room, those of us organizing this gathering share a background in human systems dynamics, which is a powerful pathway for personal transformation and collective transformation. Several of us had been talking with each other about transitions in our lives and about the way that human systems dynamics has influenced our own relationships with mortality, our own mortality, with the lives of the lives and death of those we love, and deaths of those in our communities. An idea arose, which was to join these individual conversations we'd been having and to bring them together in a spirit of inquiry to increase awareness, resilience, and our own capacity with grief. We put out a call to people we really thought might be interested in joining us in this exploration, and then you came. So that's the inspiration for doing this. And it is just a great joy to look around this circle and see who responded to that call. It's you. Our morning together is going to start by hearing from our three storytellers, and there'll be a pause in between each story for you to have a little bit of solo reflection, a brief pause, and then after a break, there will be an opportunity for you to develop your own healing narrative by joining a few other people to share stories, if you choose. To end our time together, after this small group time, we'll gather back in this large circle, we'll reconstruct our circle, to surface what has emerged about resilience out of chaos, about what is possible in terms of healing when cure is not possible. Our role today is really to listen to each other and to listen each other into presence. Please give yourself and each other whatever space you need, as whatever you feel is what you feel. And I think as Glenda has sort of modeled, we can talk and cry at the same time. We can pause. Whatever arises is welcome. Just do what you need to do to care well for yourself. And in that, we will care well for each other. Just want to say, there are some pretty wonderful human beings in this room. And I just want to invite you to connect in the moments that we will have to connect with each other. And we'll have a little bit more time directly to meet in small groups later and during our break. But for right now, I just wanted to invite you to connect by listening. And the first person I wanted to welcome us to listen to is one of those pretty wonderful humans, Mary Nations, who's joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina. So I wanted to invite Mary and your story. Welcome.
Thanks, Wendy.
You bet.
And thanks y'all for being here. It's a lovely gathering. I've heard all your names. Now I get to look at you all, so it's really, really nice. So with all those introductions, I'll just say I'm here today to tell stories. And these stories are related to HSD and related to dying. So HSD has become very embedded in me, so HSD will show up in my stories, but I'm not going to be pointing it out explicitly. I'll just share my stories as a storyteller, and I think more about HSD will emerge later, and we'll be happy to talk about any curiosity you have about that. So first story, Crystal and I got married in 2014. We got married twice because this was when we needed to go elsewhere outside of North Carolina. So we went to Washington, D.C. to get a civil ceremony and be legal in a place. And then we came back the next week and we got married in our church and had a hell of a party. It was really great to have that time with community and just, we had no idea how much fun that was going to be. The next year, about the time of our anniversaries, Crystal was having some weird symptoms, and she was diagnosed with cancer. By early 2016, she was gone. Our relationship by calendar was 10 months, 10 years, a month, and 2 days. But that's really not much of a story. So I want to tell some deeper stories. My challenge has been to know what stories to tell, because there's infinite stories, even in a decade together. And even if there weren't just infinite stories, there's infinite ways to tell those stories. And so I've been thinking about this a lot in being here today. And one reason all these stories are fascinating to me, and it's been deep work, is because each time I encounter the stories, they're different. I recall them differently, I tell them differently. Having your presence here today, I'm telling them differently. And just having someone listen to my stories changes me. So in your presence and in your listening, I'm shifting. So these stories are ongoing. And so I just want to hold this space and time today as our opportunity to change together. I have a quote I'd like to share that helps me make sense of living my story as a transformative change process. This is from Arnold van Gennep, who coined the term rites of passage. So the quote goes, "Life itself means to separate and to be reunited, to change form and condition, to die and to be reborn. It is to act and to cease, to wait and rest, and then to begin acting again, but in a different way. And there are always new thresholds to cross." So for me, compelling stories are about crossing new thresholds. Perhaps listening to stories can bring to mind new notions of thresholds to be crossed. With this in mind, I'll share some stories about my last months with Crystal. So when she first had some odd, disparate symptoms in early 2015, we didn't know what was to come. She was tired all the time, and her symptoms didn't really cause immediate concern, but she wanted to get them checked out. But within a few weeks, we had a stage 4 diagnosis and a plan of action that was just tenuous. She had been just about to start a new job. I had plans, and everything shifted like an avalanche. Our base was gone. All our plans became emergent, and we felt like we were in an emergency. As I was grappling with this, I spoke with Glenda about her experience with John and how they navigated finding grace together and separate in that knowing that a big transition was coming, and how important that separate and together part was. And as our life was taken over with doctor's appointments and treatment sessions, Crystal vented to me about how, when offering support, well-intentioned medical staff would say, "We're with you all the way." And she did not buy that nonsense. She knew well that she was ultimately alone on her path, despite all the help anyone could offer. The statement, treatment, not a cure, had been uttered. I empathized with her anger, and it was anger. She got tired of hearing this lie. A lie because she felt so distinctly and starkly alone. And it was just too much to hold inside. I could only serve as a witness, and venting to me wasn't enough. So one night, she went out and screamed into the woods behind our house till she no longer had voice. She was good at knowing what she needed, even if she couldn't get what she needed, really. Glenda's reflection and Crystal's reality changed me and changed our relationship. A wise friend told me, a cancer diagnosis is not one person's reality, it is a system reality. I've also come to realize it is both an avalanche and a creeping realization. As Crystal began treatment, she chose to spend her time in the chemotherapy clinic alone. She wouldn't even let me walk her in. So each time I drove home alone to wait for her call, I hated leaving. I didn't get anything done while waiting. But I also wanted to honor her choice that gave her the slightest bit of control. And I too needed my alone time. I worked from home, and I would go up to my office and shut the door and have time to work, but also to connect with people that I wanted to talk to process what I was going through, my anxiety, my wonderings. I came across the term anticipatory grief, and the mere existence of such a term gave me great grounding. There was not a start time for grief in this process, and I'm pretty sure there's no end time either. Framing this uncertainty gave me a way to deal with changes day to day. For instance, I could determine who offered me what kind of support that felt right in the moment, and I really got better at asking for it. One morning after breakfast together, I turned to head upstairs as per usual, and I heard this quiet voice say, "You do know I'm dying, right?" I turned back, sat down, and we had a very deep conversation, more so than we'd had in weeks. We really needed to connect as us. I didn't go to my office after that. I found ways to do whatever I needed to in the living room. That living room was a more important place to be. Another time, Crystal was having a day where nothing was going well. She felt lousy and irritable, and that came out towards me. We were supposed to be going somewhere, I don't know where, and she really was taking out all her frustrations, and I was the one there. So she started on the fact that I still had choices and control, and I had no idea what it was like to be her. So we got out to the car, and I began driving, but we just had this heavy tension. She was right. We were dealing with very different realities. We went a few miles in silence, and again I heard this voice. "I'm sorry. It's just that I wanted to grow old with you." We sobbed our way across another threshold. Again, she had broken attention, naming what we were avoiding. She was so courageous in getting to the heart of the matter. An incurable cancer diagnosis is not one person's reality. It's a system reality. We were so fortunate to have a wonderful system of family and friends that supported us in myriad ways, from meals to walks to deep research into cutting-edge treatment options. we each had different ways we connected with this greater whole. I handled the detailed what we know, what we don't know, and still emerging questions, emails to friends and family after every medical appointment. This helped me stay focused and grounded and think about what do we know now, what's knowable, and what's unknowable. And I found it really calming to get the known details down, get those out to people, to start to explore the unknowable, like if we're shifting regimens and what do we need to do for our schedules and working with others. And I just put the unknowable aside. Writing this also helped me provide boundaries. So I didn't have to talk to people over and over about all these updates because that was just too exhausting. I was grateful that people respected those boundaries so I could save my energy for my girl. And this sharing that I was doing took a lot of burden off Crystal so that she could write in her blog and connect with people in the way she wanted to. She wrote posts as the Spirit moved her, and she really enjoyed developing her audience, which started responding to her. Families and friends that she knew, and people from my circle she had never met, and then it got broader. She could be very upbeat, and she could be brutally honest. She worked hard to keep a comedic edge while sharing her emotions from gratitude to anger. She was beautifully authentic and quite adept at making interesting connections. One of her favorite series was Lonesome Dove, and she could just recall dialogue from that, pull it up, and tell a story about that scene and then relate it to something in her life. It was beautiful. She was cheered on from around the world. So she was alone in her journey, but not alone at all, or both. Crystal developed another lovely outfit for her creativity, inspired by her dad's wife, who makes greeting cards. She began a creativity group at our church, and people showed up that knew they had no creativity at all but wanted to hang out with Crystal. This group is still going. They meet regularly at church in the small group. They also go to a women's in residence recovery home down the street from our church, and they work with up to 50 women who now have ways of connecting with their family and friends with something that they made, and it's very meaningful to them. At church, they offer these cards for donation, and they've raised thousands of dollars and supported a lot of different projects. They get to choose each month who they're going to support. And they sent me a list, and I was kind of blown away by the variety of groups they're helping, also around the world. So that's still going strong. They've established and strengthened connections for families within and far beyond our congregation. So I love how Crystal shared her spirit and still shares her spirit. Our base shifted, yet is reestablished. Going back to the earlier quote I mentioned, life itself means to separate and to be reunited, to change form and condition, to die and to be reborn. It is to act and to cease, to wait and rest, and then to begin acting again, but in a different way. And there are always new thresholds to cross. I have more appreciation for life's stretch and fold moments that arise when we see the need to act again, but in a different way. I'm grateful that I had my time with Crystal, and it's been a wonderful portion of my life, even as she crossed the threshold that changed our physical presence we had together. My journey is still unfolding. I have new relationships with my stories as memories, with myself, and with the people and things I've encountered beyond my life with my wife. Choosing what stories to tell is part of my ongoing stretch and fold. Speaking my stories changes them and changes me and potentially changes you. One more quick quote. Things can be both immensely difficult and intensely beautiful at the same time. You don't have to hide either side. Remember, the night sky is eerily desolate and also full of everything all at once. This quote represents conversations I've had with another recent widow. We have both been repeatedly amazed how beautiful we find the world, even without our spouses by our sides today. We share our stories, our wonderings in the midst of the night sky. Our futures are full of unknowns despite any planning efforts we do. For me, this session is an invitation to invite each of us to consider the unknown as we share and listen and make some new meaning together. I think this can open up new opportunities for the future, separately and perhaps together. So I welcome this opportunity to change with and be changed by you. Thank you.
The next story that we're going to hear is from Sam. Welcome.
Hi, family. We are all relatives. Those of us who sit in the circle and those who have touched our lives, whose names we called out. As you listen to my brief story, I want you to listen with acknowledgement and openness to those names you called out. And as you're listening, I want you to listen for both yourself and for those names you called out. Because when I say we are all relatives, I don't just mean those of us we can see visibly in this circle. That's consensus reality, that this is reality, what we can see, what we can touch. Because what we can see and what we can touch and what we can listen to and what's available to us in relationship is always bigger than what we can notice in consensus reality. So I want to have us listen from essential reality. And I want to appreciate Kyoko's request not to clap and the sister's, acknowledgement that we can do this instead. We rub our hands together. When Michael and Wendy and Glenda and Mary and I thought about the invitation that we wanted to invite you all into, we all did a spiral. We all did this motion. And so I just encourage you as you're listening to my story, if any moment in my story touches you, that you can both first acknowledge that your beautiful sacred feet are touching the beautiful sacred earth and just let them sink in deliciously. And then you can also just kind of do this motion. Because earth and sky are united, and when we touch earth and sky simultaneously, our belly opens. And when our belly opens, spiritual conversation opens. And when spiritual conversation opens, all of the possibilities of possibility open. Life is delicious. You are delicious. I'm going to quickly tell 4 stories about people who I'm extremely close to. And notice I'm speaking in present tense, people I'm extremely close to. And then I'm going to tell a broader contextual story from a systems perspective about this little thing we call death. First thing I want to say is that we are standing on the land of the Anishinaabe and Dakota people. And their blood and their bones and their tears wash in this land. And their dreams still sing from this land. Their dreams still sing from this land. In your own heart and in your own spirit, the dreams of the people who have touched your life, who are no longer here in consensus reality, they are still singing. Glenda is still in relationship with John. Mary is still in relationship with Crystal. I am going to tell 4 stories about people I'm still in relationship to. And the first one who died in 2006 is my father, Samuel Hugh Grant Jr. He gave me his name. So whenever I wake up in the morning, I feel as though I am an embodied reflection of my father in many ways. My first words as an infant were "shut up, Dad," because my father was verbally abusing my mother. So I grew up loving my father, appreciating his living example as a civil rights, activist and organizer and an amazing, operatic singer who actually sang on the stage with Paul Robeson. But not appreciating that during his life, I had the opportunity to really have great memories of father-son time. That's not a gift that I really got. So when my father began his journey of passing on with a brutal case of dementia and Alzheimer's, I was really disturbed that we couldn't communicate in that space. I found myself really, really angry and resentful of this guy, that he was leaving in a way that made it more difficult than I had hoped to really relate to him, so that there was this beautiful transition that everybody hopes for when somebody you love passes on. But here's the amazing gift. After my father did what we call in consensus reality death, our relationship opened. All that ever was still is. Anyone who you love and you miss is available for dialogue, for relationship, for moments of sweetness. Your narrative about life and death stands as a barrier between ongoing relationship, which is there. Claim it. My father and I share a number of patterns and realities. One pattern we share, and I'm bringing up this book, which is kind of contentious, from H. Rat Brown, and the book title is Die, Nigger, Die. Something my father and I share is that we both were, victims of attempted assassination by white people. They tried to kill him when he was a teenager at a protest. They tried to kill me as a young boy because my family integrated a white neighborhood where we weren't welcome. And my father was gone, so I was the target. So we share this story. But we also share the story underneath this story, which is the story of being unconquerable, which is really a delicious thing. So in consensus reality, we were trained to fear death. And by fearing death, our capacity to communicate at that transitional moment closes off and gets constrained and limited. And we miss the possibility of the richness of that space and moment and what follows beyond it. So the what, so what, now what of my relationship with my father is he was my first primary teacher of the reality that he's not gone. So if he's not gone, the so what is I can continue to be in beautiful relationship with him, and my relationship is richer now than it ever was. So knowing that, what's my now what? Using Glenda's teachings from adaptive action, what, so what, now what? My now what is that all of the things my father and I contested about, this idea of democracy, and how do I, in my own way in the world, bring it alive in ways that honor his walk and also honor mine. I'm going to let that wash for just a second. Thanks for being here, Dad. The second story I want to tell is a story of my first daughter. My wife and I were delighted to be bringing a beautiful little being into the world, but the being chose differently. She chose to work with us from the spiritual realm rather than the physical realm. So she didn't make it into this world the way we had intended for her to make it into this world. And we went down to a spot, a very sacred spot in southern Minnesota, the confluence of 3 rivers on the Prairie Island Native Nation, where I had been mentored by an elder there who's also, still working with me. His name was Amos Owen. But we were there in this beautiful spot, and we did a ceremony to honor our beautiful little daughter. And where we stood, there were little samaras, the little seeds for trees all over the ground. And so together, my wife and I picked one up and held it in our hand. And in a mutual dance, we gave flight to our daughter. The wind came at just that moment, and that samara went up to the Sky Nation. It never landed. So because the wind carried her up to the Sky Nation, her name became Breeze. So with our daughter, who is here with us in Consensus Reality, whose name is Soul, we still regularly honor Breeze every time the wind blows. Every time we see a samara, we pick it up and dance with the samaras. Breeze continues to live, and she continues to be the older sister of my daughter. And she continues to be a mentor to her, and she also continues to be a mentor to me and my wife. So the what, so what, now what of Breeze is that any time you encounter the wind, you encounter the blessing of connection to Spirit. The so what is to get out of your ego and to realize that there's so much more available in consciousness and relationship than consensus reality. We need to stop tricking ourselves. And the now what? As I'm looking at my relatives in this circle, my beautiful, sacred relatives, I love you. I pray and beg, beseech and request that you open your belly, that you open your mind, that you open your heart, that you open your life story to continued relationship with those that you miss dearly. They're still here. They are still here. It's an African proverb that says that as long as the memory of a life persists in a culture, that life persists. As long as the memory of a life persists in a culture, that life persists. And that doesn't just mean that it persists in your memory. It can also persist in your dialogue. It also can persist in your parenting. It can persist in your wifing and husbanding. It can persist in your teaching. It can persist in your facilitating. It can persist in your singing. It's available to work with you. And in fact, it wants to. Let your relatives continue to dance with you. Let them continue to cry with you. Let them continue to breathe with you and through you. My sacred daughter, thank you for being here with us. My third story is about my mother, who is one of my favorite people ever in the history of the world. Alice Mae Wanzer Grant brought me in. And she was an educator. I am an educator. I am continuing to be guided by her as an educator. My mother prayed, because I was such a belligerent son, that I would have a child who would be just as belligerent as I was. And she got her wish. My daughter is perfectly belligerent, which makes us best friends. Because I can only delight in her moments of belligerence, and so she just starts to laugh when she's trying to be a tough kid. Because I just laugh and we start to cry together. So, oh, Dad, I can't just piss you off, can I? It's all delightful to me. It's all precious. So, this is a picture of my mother with my daughter and her cousin, who was actually my nephew's son. So this is my mother with Sol and Asim, sharing a moment of delight while my mother was still, here in this realm. And we moved back to Minnesota from California, specifically so that my daughter could hold in her consciousness a deep knowing of my mother for the rest of her days. It's the only reason we came back here to Minnesota. And it was worth it. So this is my mother and Sol and Asim. When my mother passed, I was in the midst of doing a 3-day workshop on deep democracy. She died on the 2nd day of the workshop. I got a call at 8 in the morning just as I'd come into the space to set up that you better get over here. So I dropped everything and had my co-facilitators handle the day, and I went and I laid down next to my mother during the transition, and I just laid there for 8 hours until the hospital staff said, no, we gotta kind of take the body now. But I had a full day, a full work day, right? Put in 8 hours of work laying with my mother, allowing me to feel that sweet vibrational music of absolute, utter, unconditional, perfect love. I'm a really lucky son that Alice chose to be my mother, chose to put up with all of my pitiful belligerence, and help me be who I am then, and help me be who I am now. Thank you, Mother. The final story is about my best friend who died in a tragic car accident just 2 years ago, in 2016 in April. His name was Kirk Washington Jr. Kirk always said, as an artist, and he says that there's an illusion that some people are creative and some people aren't. That to be living is to be creative. To not be honored as a creative force in the universe is to be dishonored spiritually. So part of Kirk's message is to never allow yourself to dishonor yourself. Love yourself as a creative force in this universe. And stop allowing other people to dim your creative light. Stop allowing other people to dim your creative light. The world needs you full tilt boogie. And it needs you to open to relationship with those who've gone on before you, so that they can nourish your creativity, because they came in as your guides. And now, in this other capacity, they are your teachers, still available to help you in your creative dance in the universe. Honor them and continue to work with them. So now, having shared those stories, I'm assuming I'm getting close to time. Oh, past time. So I want to say this quick. In the African experience globally, there's some scholars who talk about slavery as social death. I know so many people who are alive in their body, but they feel like they're already dead. Because their sense of possibility has already been constrained before their birth. So there's another form of death that is really violent and pernicious that we're all participating in, and that's social death. The social death of patriarchy, the social death of heteropatriarchy, the social death of capitalism, the social death of white supremacy, the social death of colonialism and genocide. We as relatives have an obligation to honor each other's lives and no longer stand by idly while any pattern of killing is alive in the waking realm. I invite you to stand opposed with all of your being, to love life and to give life in all ways at all times to those who are here in this realm now, those who are coming after us, and those who have gone on before us. Many blessings.
Michael, would you like to come up and tell us a story?
So 6 years ago, I was working a lot with Wendy and with Sam, sometimes with Myron, Sheila, Mike, and oftentimes they would talk about things like patterns and fractals and differences and containers and exchanges, and it's like they were speaking Chinese, which I didn't understand. And I was like, I want to know that language. And I eventually realized that that language comes from human systems dynamics. So I took Glenda's training about human systems dynamics 6 years ago, and I wanted to be able to understand them. And I wanted to apply the practices of noticing patterns and influencing those in my work as a consultant with organizations, and in influencing patterns in communities to be more just and sustainable. And I didn't know at that time that a few years after that, I'd be applying the same practices after getting a diagnosis of terminal brain cancer. And Glenda sometimes talked about the practices of HSD are in a way most useful if it's a situation where you don't have a lot of control, you can't predict too much. And when I got this diagnosis of the most aggressive kind of brain cancer and learned there was no cure for it, and that on average people died 18 months after diagnosis, even with the normal treatments, that situation felt like I don't have a lot of control, can't predict much, it feels intractable. And I remember Glenda saying, if a situation feels intractable, this means you can kind of shift your perspective, find a new angle, a new level to influence patterns. Well, I wanted that. That sounded better than chemo and death. So I did the standard treatment for my diagnosis, even though it's not very promising. Brain surgery, and then chemo and radiation together. And one day when I was doing the chemo and radiation, I noticed some liquid coming out of my head where the incision was from the surgery. And I eventually realized it was spinal fluid leaking out because the incision hadn't fully healed yet. And so what I eventually did is I went to the hospital, and a kind and scary doctor stuck a tube into the lower part of my back, threaded it up my spine, and then for about a week, I was on a bed in the hospital, laying right on top of that thing sticking up my spine, connected to a machine that would drain the spinal fluid out of my back in hopes that that would take the pressure off the wound up here and it could heal. After several days in the hospital in that uncomfortable position, I was awake in the middle of the night. It's about 2 in. I couldn't sleep. And I was thinking a lot about patterns, but it wasn't helpful thinking. Sam mentioned the spiral, but I was doing a very downward spiral in my imagination of thinking I'm on a free fall through different symptoms and side effects. that get treatments, and then those treatments lead to other side effects, in a free fall through side effects and symptoms to death, and felt just knotted up in my belly. And I knew that if the leaking of spinal fluid didn't stop, I'd need another brain surgery to put in a shunt, which might lead to another infection. So I felt stuck in that free fall. And I thought I heard someone come in the room, and there were nurses that would come in oftentimes and adjust the machine, sucking the spinal fluid out, increase it or decrease it. And I looked around, but I didn't see anybody that came in the room. And then I thought I heard a voice. Again, I looked around, didn't see anybody. And after you've been in the hospital several days, some strange things can happen. And then, to my surprise, I was sure that I saw and heard Martin Luther King Jr. come up next to my hospital bed, kneel at my bed, call me son, which I appreciated because we never had that kind of intimate relationship. It was more like a distant admiration relationship. But he felt very close. And then he delivered to me the end of the speech he gave the night before he died. And he knew then that his life was very much in danger and that there were many death threats against him. And he saw his own death coming. And in Memphis that night, as well as at my bedside, he told me the end of his speech, which was something like, "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now. I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because God's allowed me to go to the mountaintop. And I've looked over, and I know that I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. Because mine eyes have seen the glory, and all I want to do now is do God's will." And as Dr. King breathed this into me at the hospital bed, he breathed in a different kind of pattern logic into me, a phrase that Glenda uses. That he was able to see beyond the pattern of his own individual life into the larger patterns, as he would say, of building the beloved community. And to rest in the joy and surrender that comes from belonging to and surrendering to those larger patterns. And as he breathed that into me, he helped me know that even if I don't get to see my kids graduate from high school, even if I don't get to grow old with my wife, if I don't get to see our country get out of this fearful time, that we as a people will get to the promised land. And that if I am faithful as he was to the small steps I'm asked to do, I can also surrender into those larger patterns with joy. I eventually went to sleep that night in the hospital. And a couple days later, the spinal fluid dripping out of my head, it did stop coming out. And I was able to go home. And it's been more than 2 years since that night in the hospital. And almost all of those days, I've felt good, and I think I have been alive all those days. And I've had lots of opportunities to notice and feel and see how I belong to those larger patterns and see how I can contribute to them while I'm alive And that as Sam told the stories, that death doesn't stop those patterns, it just changes them. And the pattern outside of myself that's most immediate to me, most meaningful, is the way I influence and contribute to the patterns of my 2 children, and that I so much long to be there, to be here with them as they grow into adults. 16 years ago, this summer, my first child was about to be born, thanks to my wife. And I was with some friends in Philadelphia about a month or 2 before our first child was born, and I had a meltdown with these friends because I was terrified that the emotional patterns in my life would be passed down to and constrain this child who was about to be born. And that the shyness in my life and the ways fears kept me withdrawn from life, afraid to fully engage, I was terrified that would limit this child being born. But when my son was born, a couple months later, I was in the hospital and I picked him up when he was slimy and crying for the first time. And of course, as I did hold him, he changed the emotional patterns in my life from that first moment. And now, 16 years later, that little baby is here making a video of our event. And at 16, he is exponentially more engaged with life than I was at 16. Creatively, in his vision, in his relationships, in his heart. And he has taught me that the patterns we receive are not cages we have to live in, but platforms we can jump off of. About 2 years ago, when I finished all the medical treatment that was available, a bunch of surgeries, chemo, radiation, clinical trials, bunch of stuff, I still knew my prognosis wasn't good. Most people still died within months in that situation. And so I decided I was going to do something every day to support my health and well-being outside of the medical system. And I decided to go sit next to the Mississippi River every day out of a trust that if I noticed and felt the ways I belonged to the broader patterns of that watershed and that beautiful place, that might trickle down to my healing and hopefully in other directions too. And one part of my practice of going to the river is that with the people closest to me in my life, together we have found particular spots along the river that are our shared place. With my kids, with my wife. And my son and I, we picked a place not too far from here. It's a little hidden part of a cliff looking over a bend in the river. And you can see 4 miles of the river from there. I measured it recently. And I went there several times in the past couple weeks preparing for today. And Wendy, I remember saying many times that oftentimes it's useful to go up to the balcony, look out over the dance floor, notice the patterns, then go back down to the dance floor, try out some new moves, see how that shifts the patterns, go back up to the balcony. So when I'm on the cliff, that is my spot, my son and I picked out, it's a balcony for me, or a mountaintop, as Dr. King said. And I can see and feel the ways I'm a part of the Mississippi River, that water that lives in me, and I can watch the herons and the eagles fly up and down over the river and fly with them. and know that I'm just one part of a larger pattern of my ancestors and my descendants, both literally and metaphorically. And across the river from that cliff spot, there's a spot my wife and I picked out together that's at the bottom of the gorge, right next to where the water goes past. And my wife has been in the bottom of the valley with me in the last 3 years. That when I've been throwing up from intense pain, she's emptied my puke bowls, brought them to me clean. When I've had IV bags I had to change at home, she's changed them with me. And when I sit at the bottom of that gorge with my wife or by myself and feel the water rushing over me, feel the cancer washing over me, breaking me open, I feel more open to life and to death. And so today, I ask you, what are the places, the people, and the practices that take you up to the balcony and the mountaintop to see and feel the bigger patterns you're a part of? And what are the things that move you into the river and the valley that open you up to the particulars of life and death?